Here we are. And if you have to leave early this morning, but wish to continue hearing about the town hall, A, it's being recorded, and B, we're meeting again, having another one on October 21st, as you can see on the slide at 7 o'clock. And the Zoom will be on the calendar. I want to introduce the members of the Bylaws Task Force. We are empowered, if for no other reason for that, but by the Policy and Governance Committee. And you can see here the members and our past and current involvement at East Shore. And Grace Colton is our chair, as she is with the Policy and Governance Committee. And the rest of us have been around a while. Thank you. Next slide, please. Our agenda this morning is why we're reviewing the bylaws at all. The policy and governance overview, the bylaws revision timeline, exactly what is being updated in future updates, hopefully by our June congregational meeting. At our June meeting this past year in 2021, the congregation voted to endorse some updates of our bylaws, but we wanted to make clear that this is only the tip of the iceberg. Our task force has been empowered to review all of East Shore's bylaws to ensure that they are up to date, that they comply with Washington state law, that they conform to UUA standards, that they are easy and useful to understand. Next slide, please. The bylaws need to be lean, long-term, and broadly inclusive. And all of our bylaws were created over time with good intention and service to our community, but it's time for a comprehensive review and update. A review of our bylaws is long overdue, and our bylaws sort of grew since the early times in the 1950s, and they've been added and changed over time, many without a comprehensive look at their format, conformity to what is expected for a small not-for-profit like East Shore, and the legal compliance or scope. One update, for example, is that many of our bylaws contain examples or descriptive language that severely limits their scope. And anytime you see for example, that talks about that example, but omits all the other possibilities. And so what isn't there doesn't count. And this only limits what we've decided is legal and workable and broad. The last revision to the bylaws was in 2017, but that was only mostly for cleanup, and nobody on the task force can really remember the last deep revision of our bylaws. It's important to state that not all of our bylaws do need changing, and many are foundational to our existence, and these will not be altered. And we also thought that there are some that we should clean up, at least as an interim measure for our ministerial search. It's thought that many of our ministerial candidates will want to know a bit about our governance. And so if there are some that can be easily reviewed in the process before the congregational record goes in, as Ann mentioned today in the service, that will be good. We want to get rid of errors, outdated language, and inconsistencies so that the packet that goes out to prospective ministers allows East Shore to shine. And in addition, there are changes to the laws, and some of those we just learned about recently. For example, the state asks for bylaws, which we don't have yet, on document retention, if our board is paid or not, the limits to the board's political activity, and other conflicts of interest that may appear. Our bylaws must reflect state requirements, and compliance is necessary. Next slide, please. So why should we review the bylaws? Well, here's taking effect January 1st, and this is what we just heard about a couple, 3 weeks ago, is that there are new, there's a new law signed by Governor Inslee this year talking about statutes that are changing, and we must comply with those too. There are new rules on governance documents, membership, fiduciary rules, youth as directors. And so we must take that into account. Additionally, not-for-profits should expect and plan for the following changes effective January 1st. Now, no one really thinks that we're going to be dinged if we don't make that deadline, but it's important for us, since we're doing this review, to take that into effect. There are some things, there are notice and meeting changes, and we've had one of those. We've allowed email notices by default during the COVID times, and our bylaws are out of date in that regard. We have to talk about the fiduciary duties of our members. The new act establishes that members in general do not have fiduciary duties to the not-for-profit. And this is a significant change and will affect the liability by our members, and will certainly by our board, and will impact the bylaws of existing not-for-profits, East Shores included. Next slide, please. This is a great graphic that shows the way that our procedures are linked to state and federal law. State and federal law, of course, are foundational, and our bylaws and our policies and our procedures must adhere to law. So and let's talk about some definitions in this as well. Per the state, the articles of incorporation allow East Shore to exist. Without the articles of incorporation, according to the state, we don't exist. So that's foundational. And then if you go up to the yellow line there, the bylaws must enhance the articles of incorporation and certainly not be inconsistent with the articles of incorporation, And on up the line, the policies must enhance the bylaws and not be in contradiction. If there are contradictions in our policies or our procedures, the bylaws win. The articles of incorporation really win, and state law is really the winner of them all. And the policies describe where the board fulfills its duties and serves the ministry of our church or the work of our church, exploring spirituality, building community, practicing love, and promoting justice. The staff procedures fall under the policies and provide the details of everyday work. The overview that we come to will reduce the gaps. The Bylaws Task Force will be proposing changes to some bylaws and possibly additional policies and policy revisions. Again, I wish to emphasize that not all of our bylaws will need to be revised, but we will be looking at all of them. The review will identify which current bylaws may need to be changed to policy. Language belongs in policies that can be more short-term and changeable as the needs and the practices of the congregation evolves. The UUA and bylaw experts for not-for-profits recommend that policies, not bylaws, define the day-to-day organizational decision. Policies can be changed more easily than bylaws. It's important to note that East Shore bylaws require a congregational meeting to be changed. So this presentation today is in preparation for our congregational meeting next week, because we do have a bylaw change to propose. Policies are proposed, changed, and adopted outside of the congregational meeting process. And we can go through that a little bit later in this presentation this morning. All task force recommendations will be approved by the Policy and Governance Committee, amended if necessary, then approved by the board, and finally voted on by the congregation. This process will not change with this review. We reflect a move of details into policy. We want to make sure that the UUA standards and updated bylaw standards for not-for-profits like East Shore are adhered to. The UUA and bylaws experts and the church's attorney, we will have an attorney review this at the final point here, will all express the views that bylaws do not need to include every matter of policy. A simple example is Article 4, bylaw number 4 on non-discrimination. In 2004, this was an emerging issue, and the UUA suggested that some statement be included in our bylaws. However, today it isn't recommended that this be included. So the task force will recommend where this important provision needs to be located. Again, bylaws do not need to include every matter of policy because bylaws are generally amended only through the congregational meeting process. Nimble congregations will create policies, operating guidelines, and procedures that stand apart from the bylaws to govern day-to-day matters. These can be amended more easily as needs evolve and change. There is a site on the uua.org/leadership/library/bylaws guide, which we are using when we go through our overview and our revisions. It's important to note that the politics of moving things from bylaws to policies, this represents a big shift at East Shore, and it's important that everybody understand that. The task force would like you to know, everyone to know, to realize that moving details out of the bylaws into the policy is a shift in governance power. Policy making will be where the board and congregation and staff interact over how things are done. Again, policy making will be where the board and the congregation and the staff interact over how things are done. Bylaws will be a basic church and law-oriented document that will only change if the laws or the UU faith changes. This is a shift in how bylaws and policies are thought of at East Shore. We expect the board needs to be open about this. The task force will be otherwise. This project could be seen as power grabbing and manipulative, so it's important that everybody understand how changes are made. Bylaws are voted on by the congregation. Policies are handled by the board with input from the congregation. So for the immediate next step, which will be next Sunday, as you can see here on the left, this shows the flow of how that's going to work. The updates are anticipated for our ministerial search and require board approval. This vote, again, is next Sunday. As time goes on, there'll be more in-depth edits and changes in moving some bylaws and language to policies. It requires more complexity and more discussion. And the final touch here is that these will be reviewed by a nonprofit attorney. And yes, that's been budgeted for this year. And then there'll be final vote approval. And then at our congregational meeting in June, we don't have the final date for that. The whole package, we're hoping will be complete to be voted on by the congregation. Now there'll be some future updates. Our task force is empowered to continue until we're done. Hopefully that will be June. But if it isn't, we'll just keep on going. So we will be adding new legally required sections to the bylaws and articles. For example, we need something in our bylaws about a whistleblower provisions, document retentions, something as simple as document retentions. There will be a final review by a not-for-profit attorney who will look at all of our documents before we present them to the congregation. And this attorney will ensure that there aren't any gaps in our bylaws or legal loopholes that might exist. This will be setting the church up for success, reducing potential liability and risk. And this has been budgeted to happen before June of 2022. At the bottom check mark here, making the path to membership more flexible, is just one of the many things that we'll be looking at. And the qualifications for membership are outlined in Article 5. However, they may be too detailed, but maybe the bylaw can be made more flexible to decrease systemic oppression. For example, provide a pathway to membership for youth. And the bylaws changes could require that a path to membership be created in policy. The bylaw could say, eSure will have a path to membership, period. The policies would be to set that up in more detail. Next slide, please. Also in future updates, we'll be looking at the congregational business meetings. The order of business, those details may be moved to policy. The dollar amounts that are mentioned in bylaws and the methods of conducting business will be moved to policies. Should Robert's rules keep going on? So we're looking for a way to better way of conducting business, looking for ways to decrease systemic oppression and other simplifications. The way we do business in meetings, how we vote, how meetings are announced could be moved to policies. We've already have one example of one of those changes. Our bylaws require every member to be notified by mail. They require that members be present in person in order to vote. And we've already made a move to do some of this work via email or in person via Zoom, as we will next week. We'll be moving public witness bylaws into policies. The UU recommends that this be in policies now. We will be looking at reducing the minimum number of board members from 9 to 7. And we will be looking at changing the fiscal year from July through June to January through December. Okay, now it's time for your questions.